If you're watching us later on YouTube, there are always links to purchase books in the description directly below me. You can also subscribe to catch our events if you miss them live. If you're watching live, however, you can submit questions for the Q&A portion of tonight's event using the Q&A feature available to you at any time, and I will read a selection of those questions at the conclusion of Kirstin and Peter's conversation. As a reminder, you can shop for more books at literatibookstore.com for curbside pickup if you live in Southeast Michigan, or to have shipped to your home anywhere in the United States. And in lieu of a book purchase, we'd also ask that you consider a $5 donation to sustain our virtual programming. So whether you'd like to think of that as your subscription for this week, or this month, or this year's events, you can make donations at literatibookstore.com/donation. Otherwise, we simply thank you for your attendance this evening, or this morning, or this afternoon, depending on when and where in the world you may be joining us from. And I forgot to mention that I will be announcing the winner of our earring raffle during the Q&A as well. So if you purchase a book, actually, if you complete your order before 6:45 tonight, I'll drop your name into our virtual hat, and I will be picking a winner at around 6:45. And you will win a set of marvelous book-themed hand earrings. There's a picture of them on the event page that brought you here, and I'll get in touch with you afterwards to set up the mailing of those, which will be handled by our friends at WW Norton. So now that that's out of the way, let me introduce our esteemed, and we're so excited to have her, tonight's author, and as well our friend and moderator, Peter Ho Davies. Kirstin Valdez Quade is the author of The Five Wounds and Night at the Fiestas, winner of the National Book Critics Circle's John Leonard Prize. She's a recipient of the 5 Under 35 Award from the National Book Foundation, the Rome Prize, and the Rona Jaffe Foundation's Writers Award. Her work has appeared in the New Yorker, New York Times, Best American Stories, the O. Henry Prize Stories, and elsewhere. Originally from New Mexico, she now lives in New Jersey and teaches at Princeton University. And Peter Ho Davies' novel, The Fortunes, won the Ansfield Wolf Award and the Chautauqua Prize and was a New York Times Notable Book of the Year. He is the author of The Welsh Girl, longlisted for the Man Booker Prize and a London Times bestseller, as well as 2 critically acclaimed collections of short stories. His fiction has appeared in Harper's, The Atlantic, the Paris Review, and Granta, and has been anthologized in Prize Stories, the O. Henry Awards, and the Best American Short Stories. They can't hear you, but they can sense it through the powers of the internet. So please join me in welcoming Kirstin Valdez Quade and Peter Ho Davies into your living rooms.
Thank you, John. And Kirstin, it's such a pleasure to see you and to be here with you. I'm feeling the good vibes from the audience out there in the world as well. I'm very much looking forward to our conversation and to, it's a chance to welcome you back virtually, if only that, to Ann Arbor, which is a kind of snowy Ann Arbor, as I was suggesting earlier on. It was a great pleasure to have you here as a colleague. Was it really more than 5 years ago now? That seems crazy. It seems like yesterday. Oh, I think you're still muted, Kirstin.
I was trying to do the right thing because I have the dishwasher going. No, it seems crazy that it's been 5 years. Thank you so much to John and Literati, one of my very favorite bookstores. I mean, that was one of the, I remember on my interview, you guys took me to Literati, and that sold me on the job. But it's such a joy to be here with you, Peter.
Well, it's really good to see you. It's been too long. I'm very much looking forward to the conversation this evening as well. But it sounded as though you'd like to maybe start us off with a brief reading. Is that good?
Sure. Yeah, I'll read about a page and a half. So just a little bit of background on the book. The novel started as a short story that opens in Las Penas, New Mexico, on Holy Week, and one of the main characters, Amadeo, is playing the role of Jesus, and he's trying to do the best possible job, and he asks to be crucified in the Passion Play. And his teenage daughter Angel shows up. She's 15, almost 16, and disrupts all of his plans. And so she's moved in with him. She announces that she's had a fight with her mother and she's moved in. So I'm going to read just the beginning of a scene in Angel's point of view. And this takes place at Smart Starts, which is the teen parent program she attends. Angel pinches the underside of her chin as she thinks. It's journaling time, and Brianna has told them to make a list of things they each need to make their own and their babies' lives better. The first few were easy. 1, GED or high school diploma and college degree. 2, a support system. 3, a car. 4, a driver's license. 5, a job. Here, Angel is stumped. If she got a job, who would take care of the baby? So she adds 6, free babysitter, a good one. But there is no such thing, not really, not unless your mom or grandma doesn't work. Even Angel knows that. Briefly, she considers her father, then dismisses the thought. Trinity and Christy are whispering across the room. They are best friends and knew each other from before Smart Starts. We got pregnant like the same month, they're always telling people, which is either a crazy fluke or an organizational feat. Both possibilities depress Angel. Who'd like to share, asks Brianna. Today she wears her clunky sandals and a shapeless maroon sweater dress that is too heavy for outside. Jen raises her hand, tucking her silky, mousy hair behind her large white ear, preparing herself for the stage. An education. Jen smiles, anticipating Brianna's praise. Right, drawls Lizette. Education. I forgot that one. Angel grins and tries to telegraph her approval to Lizette, but Lizette's beautiful green eyes are half closed like a lizard's. On her left hand, Jen wears a promise ring with a dinky little amethyst. It's my birthstone, she said, as if none of the rest of them were born in months with birthstones. She is going to marry her boyfriend, Jared, whom she met at church and who picks her up every afternoon when Smart Starts lets out. Angel's stomach churns whenever she thinks of her own child's father, Ryan Johnson, the way in geometry he always sat in the front row, grimacing up at the board. He always raised his hand to answer questions, but was only correct about 50% of the time. It seemed crazy to Angel to keep putting yourself out there like that. But the next time Mrs. Esposito asked a question, there he was, long skinny arms swinging in the air. Hey, he told her breathlessly once in the hall after class, I thought of a name for you, a math name. For weeks he called her Angle, or sometimes, delighting himself still further, Obtuse Angle. He was so persistent she felt embarrassed for him, which, along with the tequila shots, explains why she slept with him. Her embarrassment also explains, perhaps, why she hasn't told him the baby is his.
Thank you. That's lovely. One of my favorite passages, actually. I'm really glad you chose that one. It's a beautiful book. And I think the first thing I wanted to ask, I was saying, earlier when we were waiting in the virtual green room, that I have been citing this book to students both here in Ann Arbor and actually in other places as well, as a kind of inspiration for young writers, partly because I think it has sort of addresses that challenging space of moving from a short story and becoming a novel. So you mentioned before that this The Five Wounds grew from a short story. That was, I'm going to not just flag the new book, but I'm going to flag the first book. Now, the first is a wonderful collection of stories. And so The Five Wounds first began as a story in that collection. So I was curious about the genesis from story to novel, that journey, what led to the expansion. I think this was something that was going on even 4 or 5 years ago when you were still here, and what some of the discoveries were as you made the move from the story space into the novel space.
So I don't know how inspiring a story it is, because the story was published in 2009, and about a year after it was published, my editor, who was not at that point my editor, emailed me and asked if I'd ever considered expanding it into a novel, and I wrote back and said, no, not at all, and continued to write short stories. And then about a year after that, I was looking at some story drafts that I was working on, and I noticed, like in a flash, it sort of occurred to me that I was dealing with the same basic family dynamic, the same constellation of characters. And I thought, oh God, that's Amadeo and Angel and Yolanda. I somehow hadn't seen that. And I thought back to that email and thought, maybe I do have a novel in me. I mean, clearly I was still interested in these characters. So that summer I just started to go from the next day after Amadeus crucified. And I did wonder, so what happens after a gesture like that? What happens after a huge epiphany like that? Where do you go from that? Is that epiphany enough? So that was the beginning of the novel. But yeah, I don't know how inspiring it is
Well,
because
no,
it's been a long time.
I think one of the reasons why it's so fascinating, as I think you know, a lot of young writers, I've been there, you may have been there at some point as well, wonder about how they go from writing short stories to writing the longer form, and sometimes even struggle with the question of, does this material best serve the short story, or is it best served in the novel? So to feel that it doesn't have to be an either or, that a story can grow organically into this larger space, I think that is actually really encouraging to a lot of people along the way as well. But I really like the way you're thinking into that sense of, there is a very dark, it's a very powerful, it's a very moving story, and it does end in this act of crucifixion, where Amadeo is fully taking on the role of Christ that he's playing in the Passion play. And so the question of what happens beyond that point actually points us into something that I'm really interested in the book in general. It's a book that looks at 5 generations of this family, at least 4 of whom do feel kind of wounded, actually, in certain ways. That may be not true of the most recent arrival in the family. Connor is just a baby in the book. It looks at a particular community, a small town. It thinks of it over the course of a year, from Holy Week to Holy Week. And I like that sense of a territory and a temporal space that are being carved out. And it's filled with sort of, in some ways, challenging materials. We deal with teen pregnancy, we deal with terminal illness, we deal with drug and alcohol dependency, and yet it also feels as though there's a great deal of humor in the book as well. And it feels sort of almost alchemically magical that you can manage to write so feelingly about so many of these challenging circumstances the characters feel, and do so with a light touch in many places along the way. We could hear that a little bit in that section that you read, I think. The way the girls at the Smart Starts sort of banter a little bit with each other feels like it fills some of that space along the way as well. But I'm reminded even that where does one go from crucifixion? Well, in Amadeo's case, it's to a slightly awkward moment in the ER, right? Where he's sort of wanting to jump the line in the ER, and he's talking about a kid who says to him that they have foot and mouth disease and they want to go a little before him, all those kind of questions. So there's a strange deliberate sort of bathos to that moment, from something that feels epiphanic to something that feels very mundane. I'm really interested in that. Could you talk a little bit more about the sort of the comedy in the book and the way you handle the humor in this space?
Well, thank you for saying it's funny. It felt funny to me as I was writing it, but you just never know if that comes across. I think part of it is that, yeah, a lot of what this family is going through is really serious and difficult. And but in my own experience, there's always humor. I mean, difficulty and humor are always entwined. And I even think about just terrible losses in my family and really, really hard moments. And when we gather, we're still always laughing. I mean, there's so much absurdity. And, there's just so much. Life is funny. As difficult as it is, it's also constantly funny. And, I think I enjoy being in the perspective of characters who see humor in the world, and have some self-awareness and some ability to laugh at themselves. I mean, it depends on the character. I think.
You're reminding me of a wonderful moment. Angel, who I'm trying to think who is my favorite character. It's a tough call actually because I love a number of the characters in the book. But Angel has a wonderful moment. She's had that terrible teenage moment of discovering that a parent has a sex life because she's found her mother's diaphragm by the side of the bath, I think, and she describes it as uh, a fleshier and less amiable version of the scrubbing bubbles from the commercial. And I'm not sure that I'm ever going to be able to look at those scrubbing bubbles in quite the same way. So there's a wit and a freshness to that. I think that was a moment that was laugh out loud for me in the narrative. But it also feels as though humor feels as though it's woven into, and maybe this is what you need to speak into about your family experiences, almost woven into a philosophy of life. I think there's a moment where Yolanda is talking to her oncologist, and there's a sense there in which he's talking about chance, and she's joking about having just come from Vegas, I think, and winning or losing on the tables there. And he sort of applauds her for having that sense of humor and suggesting that it's going to be a blessing for her in certain ways. And I do think there's a sense in which humor here feels like it really humanizes the characters and helps us through those moments, but also helps them through those moments as well.
Yeah, I mean, I do think without humor, well, I think certainly this story would just be sort of a drag, if it, and it would have been a drag for me to write. I mean, I think a lot of it is that I just depend on it to entertain myself as I go.
Did you feel that that was a part of that movement from writing short fiction, which I think is often a little darker and somehow more intense, into the novel space, that we need some of those notes of humor in the longer space to sort of sustain it for ourselves as writers, but maybe also for readers?
That could be, although, I mean, I think my stories are very funny. I don't know that, that doesn't necessarily come through on the Goodreads reviews, but um, but yeah, I think you're right. I think there is something. It's any piece of fiction needs an engine or several engines. And a lot of that is mystery. We're reading to find out what's going to happen, and but one of those engines is can be humor. And the writing I'm attracted to often has elements of humor. Um, yeah, not that it's constantly knee slapping, but
Sure. This also felt like a book. I mean, it seems so richly lived and richly detailed. Um, and even in its smallest interstices, I mean, you capture, I think, the experience of the girls at the Smart Starts school beautifully. But I'm thinking about even Amadeo at one point starts a kind of emergency windshield repair service. And I'm wondering about research. Was there a lot that went into this? Did you have to travel back to the space? Is it just drawn out of memory or thinking of family? I know the location itself is sort of an imagined community, although I imagine it draws a little bit from memory. So I'm always curious about that. That mixture of the imagined and the recalled and the lived and the fictionalized.
yeah, it's always a mix. This novel is contemporary, and it does the Las Penas is a fictional town, and so I didn't have to. There were a lot of things I didn't have to research because of that, but um, no, absolutely. I mean, I go back to New Mexico frequently, and one of the things that my grandfather and I um, always did together was just drive. He taught me to drive. He was a real car enthusiast, and he and I would just set off, and so we did some of that, and 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 I would maybe like couldn't quite remember where the Blake's Lotaburger was, and so I have an Espanola phone book and and a map, and so I would look things up like that. The windshield repair, yeah. So Amadeo, one of his get rich quick schemes is this windshield repair business. Um, a relative of mine had ordered one of these kits off the internet and or off the television. I'm not sure which. And so I had that in my mind. Because I always wondered, how viable could this be? I don't think he ever ended up pursuing it. But I watched YouTube videos about windshield repair, and
Right.
they'll walk you right through it.
So no, that makes me think that we can indeed do a lot of our research sort of through the computer these days in a certain sense as well. But I was curious about, there's a lovely sequence. Maybe you could tell people in the audience, because I'm not sure I can do it justice. What is exactly egg butter? It feels like it crops up in the context of a Finnish report that the girls are giving at school.
Yeah, so the girls are tasked with picking a country and researching it and writing about some of the childcare practices in that country. And so Angel and her love interest Lizette pick Finland, and the research and the working on this project become sort of an excuse for their romance. And yeah, so I mean, I did do a report on Finland when I was a kid, and and I had a good friend from Finland when I was 10 years old. So I remember being very interested in Finland. But yeah, they make this thing called egg butter, and it's just hard-boiled eggs mashed with butter, and then they smear it on pies. I but I just read today that Finland is, for the fifth year in a row, the happiest country in the world. So who am I to criticize egg butter?
Apparently, it's maybe down to the egg butter on the pies. Lizette memorably describes it when they're making it as it smells like ass. But I'm gonna assume that it tastes better than it smells, maybe along those ways. And I guess there is a way in which they choose Finland also because it has great childcare, and so it actually feels as though they're thinking into that space, and it feels like it's a small but felt way in which the book is making us think about the wider world, making us think about the contemporary circumstances, the struggles that these young women are going through. I think in some ways, and maybe the way that as a community, as a country, we maybe don't support them as well as we might do, I think in some ways. So I like the way that the humor and the seriousness of that moment toggle backwards and forwards in that space as well.
Well, it becomes this painful moment. I mean, the assignment is intended to be just, this sort of innocuous, research another country and draw the flag. But these girls discover that Finland has free healthcare and free childcare, and their support for girls and women and families. And it becomes, they're pretty resigned to, the tough path ahead of them. But when they learn about this, there's sort of an uproar in the classroom. They're really upset about this. And yeah, I mean, we let families down. Just horribly in this country. We know that, like, the research is so clear about what children need, and they need quality early childhood education, and we need to provide this for working families, and that's what helps people out of poverty. That's what combats deep historical injustice and systemic racism. I mean, not the only thing, but it's one thing that and helps women, complete school and have jobs. And so, I mean, that is a sort of political issue that I feel strongly about. And I feel like it's a tricky thing to bring politics into fiction, and a person has to be careful not to use the characters or use the story to forward a political agenda. But this it is a concern of mine. I worked at a nonprofit for a couple years that was concerned with these issues of supporting families and early childhood education. But it's I hope that that it was the kids discovering it.
No, I think that's one of the things that's so lovely about the book and so feeling is that it seems as though because we explore so intimately and so intensely the lived experience of the family as they're going through these various challenges. Amadeo is dealing with unemployment, other people are dealing with substance abuse questions. It nonetheless feels as though all of those things make the political personal. So it feels as though it's coming from the individual character spaces and beginning to reverberate outwards. And you're allowing the reader, I think, to draw those connections if they want to, I think, in some ways too. That maybe leads me into another question that I'm really curious about and really admire both in this book and in your work generally, actually, because it feels like you do it very naturally. I think if I were to try and do it, it would feel very awkward and brave, but foolhardy. So this is one of the reasons I admire it so much. You write, I think, about religion in a way that feels very feeling, again, makes it feel like it's the texture of people's lives. And I'm curious how you think into that space, how you grapple with it. It feels as though there would be real dangers into going into territory like that, the possibilities of offending some people or feeling as though it might turn off some people in various ways. And yet, whenever it happens in your work, I really respond. I'm really intrigued by it. So I'm kind of curious how you think about the role of faith or religion or the Catholic Church, especially in the fiction.
Well, Catholicism it feels very, very much a part of the New Mexico that I write about. And, when I think about New Mexico and the history of the place, Catholicism is a big part of it. I'm very close to my grandparents, and my great-grandmother used to take care of me when I was a child, and going to Mass with them was a big part of it. Lighting candles at their altars, was a big part of my childhood, in the sense also that miracles could happen. That and it's a particular kind of Catholicism. I mean, when I was a kid, I got the evil eye, and my great grandmother took me to a curandera to get the evil eye lifted, I guess. But so this sort of sense of a spiritual, magical, this possibility feels like a part of the place to me. And I've always been interested in faith and doubt and how I had both of those influences in my own life as a kid. My like I said, my grandmother is very religious, and that was a real part of my relationship with her. I attended Mass as a kid with my mother, but also, my dad is a geologist. He studies early man. I had a poster of early man on my wall when I was a kid, and I could tell you about Australopithecus, and so I had both of those influences, and I think I was interested in the contradictions, and also interested in how it didn't always feel all that contradictory to me. So
it does feel really woven into the life experience, but also maybe even the landscape. When you were mentioning that sense of the magical and the spiritual, I was reminded of the occasional but significant appearances on the road on some of those drives by a coyote who almost feels like a kind of spirit animal, sometimes looking over or looking after these characters. And it's very lightly done, but it does feel as though there's a kind of at times haunted quality to the landscape that I really responded to as I was reading the work here as well. I'm wondering though too, and I think about this both in regard to this book a bit, maybe in regard to some of your stories too, whether or not there's I'm trying to think how to speak into this. There feels like there's a kind of gendered quality in the relationships between the young female characters in several of your stories and the relationship with the church. I'm thinking about the way that Amadeo, as he's sort of preparing to play Christ in the Passion play, is kind of horrified when his teenage daughter, who's pregnant, shows up, and it's sort of, you can feel his unease, almost as though he will be rendered impure by her presence, which is a terrible rejection for her. And it seems as though the sense of his shame for her as he's trying to sort of purify himself in this moment feels as though it's one of the schisms between them, and one of the things they have to reconcile and think their way through as they're moving through the course of the narrative. And it feels like a note that I've felt in a couple of the other earlier stories of yours. I think there was a story even about was it an early saint? Was it Christina the Astonishing in the New Yorker a few years ago as well? So I'm curious how you think about the relationship of women to the church in some ways like that.
That's such a good question, because yeah, definitely in the Five Wounds, this novel, the characters who turn to Catholicism are the men. I mean, Teotihuacan reestablished this brotherhood of penitentes in the aftermath of his son's heroin overdose, when he was, really feeling the need of this community. And, Amadeo, it becomes a part of this brotherhood and really, derives great sustenance from it. The women in the book aren't terribly concerned. Yolanda, Amadeo's mother, is supportive, and she in fact sort of convinces Teotihuacan to bring Amadeo into the brotherhood, but she doesn't seem all that absorbed by Catholicism. Nobody, Amadeo and Teotihuacan are the only ones who go to church at all, and not often in the book. And Angel, I think Angel, as a pregnant and queer teenager, I think certainly doesn't feel like the church is the place she can turn for support. She turns to Smart Starts and really throws herself into that. But it's funny because I think certainly in my own life, it was the women who sort of gave me Catholicism, and yeah, it's a funny thing.
Yeah, that male sort of brotherhood, is it pronounced the Morada that the men form for themselves?
The Morada is the building, yeah.
Right. Yeah. And it feels almost as though that's it's a religious man cave. Might be too strong a way of describing it, but it feels like very much a male enclave. And when Angel encroaches upon it, it feels as though Amadeo takes sort of under forbearance and with a certain amount of nervousness into that space. So it does feel as though there's I think I'm interested in general in the way gender is addressed here, I think, in some ways. And I suppose for me that maybe comes back to Amadeo himself and the delicacy, I think, with which he's drawn as a character, because I think in less skilled hands, he might come across very easily as a kind of example of sort of toxic masculinity, I think. And yet, while I think he has many of those qualities, he's also a figure that you clearly have enormous compassion and affection for as well. And one that we feel, I think, that same sense of complex humanity for. And I find that to be kind of remarkable in a space where, maybe this is what I'm thinking about religiously, it feels also as though we are inclined to judge each other, or maybe strangers that we encounter online, according to our worst faults. And it feels as though there's an extension of kind of forgiveness going on to all the characters here, I think, in some ways. But maybe Amadeo just needs it more than most of the others, I suppose. So could you talk a little bit about his characterization, about him coming to, because he goes from this space of, in the story, feeling his passion for the Passion play feels almost otherworldly in some ways, and yet you have to bring him down into this more mundane lived experience as the novel goes on. So that felt like one of the great revelations of the novel to me.
Well, thank you for saying that Amadeo feels sympathetic, and I do have an enormous amount of affection for him. I didn't always. I mean, when I started the story, I was mad at him. I wanted the story to punish him and for him to see the error of his ways. I mean, he's a really flawed character. He's not been present in his daughter's life. He's, mooching off of his mother. He has been violent in the past. When his sister shows up, his sister has left an abusive marriage, and he tries to intimidate her by rubbing his bicep, and he comments on her body. I mean, he's a jerk.
Yeah.
But I think what makes me love him and root for him is that he's always trying to do better. He recognizes that he's failed, and he tries. He wants to be a better father. He wants to be a better son.
Yeah, no, I think that's really felt. It's there even in his aspirations to take his role as Christ as far as it can go, I think, in certain ways. But I think some of the notes that really soften him for me, even in the midst of some really terrible behaviors, are the way that even the women around him continue to have some kind of affection for him. I think that's felt from his mother, especially, of course. But I think there are even moments where his daughter is remembering moments from her childhood, where he shows kind of moments of affection for him. People cherish those things. And I think the moments that always speak to me are those moments when either he or others are recalling Amadeo's childhood. And there's something about the juxtaposition in the book of adulthood and childhood that seems kind of interesting to me. I think often men like Amadeo are in part problematized because they feel like they haven't grown up in some ways, or haven't grown into responsibility. And I think that's somewhat true of him in certain ways. But there's a way in which we feel affection for the young Amadeo in the space of the narrative as well. It may be in a strange way, I'm probably over elaborating this, but there's something about the coincidence at the opening of the novel between the crucifixion, and Amadeo is the same age as Christ as he's going through the Passion play, and the fact that Angel is pregnant with a new child in that moment, that makes us feel as though there's some kind of dialogue or toggling between adulthood and childhood, the kind of maybe faded hopes of adulthood and something about the freshness, the innocence of childhood that feels really powerful to me as I move my way through the book as well.
Yes, I mean, all of the characters are sort of dealing with they're all children, and they're all parents, and so they're trying to navigate that. And yeah, I think you're right. Certainly Yolanda and also Angel have a lot of affection for Amadeo. I mean, I think the line between affection and enabling gets a little blurry.
Sure.
But yeah, I think he does feel like he's still a child, and he hasn't, part of his emotional arc is setting that aside, setting childhood aside, and becoming the adult and the father that his daughter needs him to be. Yeah, he thinks back fondly to the time when, he was a kid, and they did some kind of IQ test, and they said he's almost a genius. He's got all this potential, and he's hung on to this idea of potential. But of course, what is potential if you don't do anything with it?
Right. Yeah, and of course we also think of him as wounded, having lost a father as well. So there's again that sense of thinking back to the wounded child within him, I think, in some ways as well, which is really touching in that space as well. I know I'm talking about Amadeo, but as I say, all the characters are really appealing to me. I think Yolanda, when she has a moment of dancing very sexily, I think, late on, but with an incredibly ugly man. There's a beautiful dance scene that they have together in a bar. It's also one of my favorite moments. So she's also a fantastic figure in this regard as well. I know John is probably going to pop in soon with maybe questions from the audience as well. So I'm going to just maybe ask one last one that I'm a little curious about. Often and I know it's always awkward when you've got a new book coming out for people to go, oh, what comes next? Because it feels like, isn't this enough? Right? I've just worked on this book for all this time. So I'm not going to ask that question. You'll be relieved to hear, although feel free to answer it if you want to. But in this moment, at the end of this very difficult year that we've all gone through, I guess I wanted to ask what comes next, not even in terms of writing, but what comes next in terms of the summer, the year, as maybe we approach a little bit a glimmer of light at the end of the tunnel. What are you looking forward to as we maybe come out of this dark space that we've been, although one that I know will shadow us for a while to come yet?
I'm looking forward to really reading a lot and playing around with my writing. It feels like a real relief to be done with this novel, and also it's a loss too, because I always knew what I needed to be working on. And I'm circling around another novel project, but I haven't committed in my heart to it, and so I'm having a lot of fun with stories, and so I'm looking forward to a summer of just reading and writing without any, just letting myself explore. And I've noticed that my stories are a little weirder than my sort of typical realist stories have been.
Yeah, no, I was noticing that with that one in the New Yorker that was just about a couple of years ago. I really loved that story. All right, well, having summoned John from the ether, I guess I will summon him back, having sort of faked him out there for a second. Sorry about that, buddy.
No, you can always summon me from the ether for as brief as you'd like. There are no questions right now, so I want to remind our viewers that they can use the Q&A to submit any questions that they have. And Peter, I'll kick it back to you if there's any questions you didn't get to, or any last questions you might want to ask Kirstin, or anything at all you want to talk about, and I can come back on when there are some questions from our audience. But I will take this time to announce the winner of our raffle and the winner of our very cool the Five Wounds themed earrings, courtesy of our friends at W.W. Norton, was Sarah Appleton Pine. And Sarah, I think you are here watching, and I will loop you in with our friends at Norton to take care of the rest, and they will ship you your prize. But thank you to all of you who purchased books and entered as well. We greatly appreciate that.
And these are earrings that are in the shape of the hands from the cover of the book.
Yes. So yes, dangle. Exactly like that. Yes. There's a picture on the event page of them as well. Yeah. If you want to see.
As I look at our Zoom screen, I feel that somehow the raise hand icon here is also sponsored by the book in a strange way.
That's right. Well, that's we do have a question from a viewer who asks, Kirstin, did you actually ever live in a small town in northern New Mexico?
So the town is based a lot on the towns where my grandparents grew up. I was born in Albuquerque, and Santa Fe is sort of home base for me. But I would go back with my grandparents to their towns where they grew up, and so that's what it was based on.
Another viewer writes, when writing, how much do you think that you pull from your own experiences?
It's such a blend of imagination and my own experiences. I mean, there are a lot of things that are from my life or family members. I mean, I think certainly my family would recognize things, but it's such a blend, and it's sometimes hard for me to even pinpoint the line between the two.
Our friend Jeremy writes, you've talked about how revision is a big part of the process of your short fiction. How has it differed or not during the writing of the novel? Was there one element of the novel that most surprised you during the drafting process?
First of all, hi, Jeremy and Natalie. It's so good to see you guys. Um, or not see you, sadly, but see your names. um, revision is a huge. It's the bulk of it for me, and with both my short stories and this novel, a big part of revision was cutting things. I mean, the novel was about 150, 200 pages longer in its early full draft. So a lot got cut. Tiotive had a whole storyline of his own that got cut. So yeah, for me, it's figuring out, okay, what is the story, and then what's essential to the story. One element of the novel that most surprised me during the drafting, it all kind of surprised me. I mean, I didn't really know what would happen. I mean, I knew early on that it would take place over the course of a year in this family's life. I knew a few things. I knew basically where I wanted some of the characters to end up emotionally, but I didn't know how they would get there or what the twists and turns were along the way. I was surprised by how many of the characters fell in love, which is not something I'm sort of proud of myself, because in my short stories there were no romantic relationships, and so I'm glad to see that it's not like my writing life is completely romance free.
When we were talking about, sorry, go ahead, John.
No, go ahead, Peter, please.
Well, no, you reminded me that I meant to circle back to that the question when we were talking about Amadeo, and you sort of talking about that sense of starting off from that place of really not liking him at all. I'm wondering if there was some moment of surprise there, or some moment where he turned that corner for you as a character. I'm curious what that was.
Well, that was in the story. That was the biggest difficulty in revision, was actually feeling real empathy for him. I think I thought I was being empathetic and embodying his experience, but I wasn't. I was still sort of hovering above him and passing judgment and wanting him to get his. So that was a tricky thing, and it was just, revision after revision after revision, and asking him, why are you behaving this way? Why? And then I could begin to really feel for him. But yeah, it was, for Amadeo, it wasn't as much a craft issue. I mean, it became a craft issue, of course, but it was an empathetic problem for me. But of course, that always translates into craft.
Lydia asks, what's the most surprising reaction you've had about the book so far?
Hi, Lydia. I sort of feel like I want to tell you afterward privately, but I'll just tell everyone. My dad said that he reads it as nonfiction, and I don't quite know what he means by that, because it's most definitely fiction. But
that seems like a disquieting reaction, actually.
It was a little disquieting, yeah.
I think we have time for one more question, and a viewer has written in with, I think, a fitting question to end on. What authors have inspired you in your writing, or do you especially enjoy reading? And any books that this is always my favorite question as a bookseller. I'm glad when someone else asks it, so I can shoehorn it in. But any books that you have enjoyed reading during this past very difficult year?
Yes, I mean, I'm inspired by so many books and writers. And then my mind goes blank whenever I'm asked this. But I do know when I started this book, I was thinking about two Catholic writers. I was thinking about Graham Greene's The Power and the Glory, and the whiskey priest who is, a bad priest, and he's not celibate, and he's a drunkard, and he still meets the needs of his flock. And I was also thinking about Flannery O'Connor's story, Parker's Back, who's this tattooed, hard drinking, alcoholic, unemployed guy who nonetheless is striving for connection with the infinite. So those two were really important. But gosh, so many writers were with me as I was writing this book. Books I've enjoyed this past year, again, a lot. I really loved Britt Bennett's The Vanishing Half. Right now I'm reading Natasha Trethewey's memoir, Memorial Drive, which is gorgeous and harrowing.
Those are two readily available books at Literati, I'm supposed to add, but those are perfectly two great books. We always love recommending Britt's books as well. We've reached the top of the hour. Kirstin Valdez Quade, Peter Ho Davies, thank you so much for joining us tonight at Home with Literati. It's so great to have you both virtually. Peter was mentioning in our virtual green room how we should do this again for the paperback, and I'd be 1,000% for that. So please, let's knock on wood that we're all able to safely get on planes and trains and automobiles and gather in rooms again soon. But until then, we hope you continue to stay safe and be well. Congrats again to our raffle winner. I'll be in touch with you shortly. And to the rest of our viewers, all who are joining us, thank you so much for your support. We look forward to seeing you at the next event. So have a great night, everybody.
Thank you so much.
Thanks, John. Thanks, Kirstin.
So good to see you guys.